All right, we're still increasing, but it looks like we've got at least 80 people on the call now, so I think I will go ahead and get started. First of all, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really sorry we can't see you all in person. Hopefully that will happen next year at our spring meeting in Seattle. But for now, we're really glad you could join us for the committee meeting. We have a lot of stuff to cover and I think some great presentations too. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we're going to start out with Dr. Ruth Carlos giving us a presentation on social determinants of health, a study she and I are spearheading. Then Elise Adams from Stanford will be talking about equity in cancer treatment outcomes. And then Dan Hertz is going to talk about screening for clinical trial enrollment and drug-drug interactions. We've got a lot of study updates coming up after that, and we'll be eager to hear from everyone who's involved in those studies listed there. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Ruth Carlos. She is a guest today and a member of ECOG Akron. Dr. Carlos is a professor of radiology and is assistant chair for clinical research at University of Michigan. She holds multiple leadership positions at ECOG Akron and has been very involved in cancer care delivery. In fact, sits on the NCI's Cancer Care Delivery Steering Committee. She is going to be talking today about a project that she and I are spearheading with NCI to develop a clinical trials planning meeting protocol for screening patients for social determinants of health in their NCORP practices. And Ruth, if you're ready, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for the invitation. This presentation will focus on addressing social determinants of health to improve cancer care delivery and outcomes among newly diagnosed cancer patients in the community setting, and it is meant to follow the umbrella trial structure that has been done really well in the therapeutic space, for example, the NCI MATCH trial. Ultimately, what we all seek is to treat the right patient with the right test, the right treatment, the right time, and for the right price. And all cooperative groups, particularly those that focus on diagnostics and therapeutics, are working feverishly to advance precision diagnostics and treatment. Against that background, however, we are also charged with taking care of the whole patient and being able to deliver patient-centered care. And this includes understanding, addressing, and supporting patients who have adverse social determinants of health, or as the nomenclature is evolving, health-related social needs. Social determinants of health, as many of you are familiar with this definition, are conditions in the places where people live, learn, work, play, and worship that affect a wide range of health and quality of life risks and outcomes. CMS has developed the term health-related social needs for their accountable health community screening tool with 5 core elements: housing instability, food insecurity, transportation problems, utility help needs, and interpersonal safety. The goal then of this trial is to develop a master protocol for a multi-site prospective controlled study within NCORP practices that will screen cancer patients for health-related social needs, test interventions that are designed to address specific health-related social needs, and have a pragmatic and flexible design that accommodates the evolving knowledge base and landscape. There is substantial evidence that health-related social needs contribute to the observed disparities in cancer treatment and outcomes. And we see this in treatment adherence, functional status, survival, and long-term economic stability. Screening tools and interventions exist, but have not been systematically evaluated in oncology practices, and particularly in community oncology practices. There are already existing umbrella trials, such as the NCI Match, which are an efficient mechanism to screen patients for health-related social needs and to test a broad range of interventions. The goals of this clinical trial planning meeting are to design or adapt an existing social needs screening tool and process, identify specific interventions to test, particularly those that are a good match, so to speak, for identified social needs, and as well as testing holistic programs. Part of the planning meeting is to gain consensus on what represents the essential elements of study design and endpoints, and to select potential mediators and modifiers of our endpoints that will be tracked a priori. NCORP has experience in novel trial designs and conducting pragmatic trials. NCORP CCDR studies have already assessed financial burden and are able to provide operational expertise in screening for selective health-related social needs from patients and caregivers. The goals of the meeting are to produce a white paper summarizing the meeting conclusions to be submitted for publication, as well as concept submission plan for an NCORP-wide prospective study, including the participating research bases, relevant investigators, and the potential timeline. The meeting logistics, as initially proposed, will be to convene for 1.5 days to discuss subcommittee presentations, select screening tools, potential interventions and endpoints, and to finalize consensus on trial design, white paper outline, and concept submission. The number of attendees, in order to make it a flexible yet representative group, are targeted at approximately 30 to 35, with multi-stakeholder groups both within and currently outside the NCI, CCDR groups, and the NCORP. And this multi-stakeholder group ensures scientific validity, patient-centeredness, and a practical approach. The attendees will represent these key areas of expertise: oncology clinical leaders, social workers, and financial navigators, patient advocates and community engagement specialists, social intervention research and researchers and evaluators, clinical trialists and trial design experts, information technology analysts to assist with EMR coding and billing issues, and regional and national organizations with a mission to address health-related social needs. The meeting will be in person for now at the NCI with a budget of approximately $50,000. The NCI has already convened at least 2 workshops and symposia in this space, including an NCI symposium on cancer health disparities, covering recent advances in the causes of cancer health disparities in rural populations and among Native Americans, as well as one convened to apply big data to address social determinants of health in oncology. There is a third being convened and organized by Brenda Ajay, looking at health-related social needs that will be hosted in the next couple of weeks. There are no other competing initiatives or activities within NCORP along the lines of an umbrella trial as we have proposed. This will be the first clinical trial planning meeting for CCDR, In addition, if the umbrella trial is a go, this will be again a first that focuses on CCDR-related outcomes. So in summary, disparities in cancer outcomes caused by health-related social needs really creates an urgent need to screen for and address them as part of comprehensive cancer care delivery, treating the whole person. NCORP is the ideal setting for studies designed to find approaches to address these social needs in community oncology practice settings, because as you know, it is large and diverse with existing robust infrastructure supporting the conduct of cancer care delivery research. The goal of this planning meeting is to design the plan for a multi-site, multi-intervention prospective controlled trial to screen and intervene on health-related social needs among newly diagnosed cancer patients. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Dr. Carlos and I are available for a few minutes to answer questions about this proposal in the clinical trials planning meeting. Let me give you just a little bit more information. We plan to hold this planning meeting as discussed in the summer. Then if it's approved, it has to go through the NCI CCDR steering committee for approval, and then for final approval from the NCI. If all goes well and all those things happen without needs for revisions, we would probably start writing the protocol towards the end of next year, with an eye towards getting the actual study going in 2023. So it's a bit of a long process, but because it's a very ambitious study, it takes time to put it together. This is, my first experience putting together a clinical trials planning meeting. I don't know about you, Ruth. Have you done one of these before?
This is my first. I've participated in others, but not convened them.
Right. So and it's, I think, the first one that's ever been done in CCDR. So we'll all be learning a little bit. And then one other thing for everyone on the call, we are forming the subcommittees now, and there are many. So if you have interest in participating on the subcommittees to help plan for this meeting, please send us an email separately and we'll get you on the list. We're particularly interested in junior investigators who are interested in jumping on this project. Let me stop and see if anyone has any questions. Oh, right. Ann Geiger also mentioned we haven't received official approval from NCI. I think it's going to be reviewed in the next few days. We're hoping that happens, but it is not assured at this point.
Just also add that, we're not used to thinking of behavioral interventions in this platform approach, although there are a lot of models out there for testing multiple different interventions at the same time with novel designs like most trials. But it's an opportunity, I think, for us to go back to our institutions and to other people we know, whether this all gets approved or not. It's all part of the same process where we have the opportunity to bring together population science expertise, people with expertise that may not necessarily be in cancer, but in health disparities research or other interventions, and people with expertise in interventions that involve community health workers and other other things that have been shown to be successful, to bring them together to try, to get a handle at solving these problems. And it might also serve as an opportunity. There are health disparity scores that were recently funded, bringing together like expertise of things, initiatives that were already funded. We're part of a P50 that is focusing on some of these things, and sort of to use our collective expertise to try to design the best trials that will inform practice.
A couple of notes from the chat. Ann Geiger put an email address for those who are interested in participating in the subcommittees. So you can also send a note to that email. Just check on the chat there, or to Ruth and I, and we will forward it on as well. There was a question. Let me just get to a couple questions from the chat. Is there the possibility that people who suffer from the disparities would not recognize it and not report it? Absolutely. And the screening tools that are out there, and there are a number of screening tools for social determinants or health-related social needs that ask people specific questions about things like housing insecurity, food insecurity, financial toxicity. So hopefully people would know what their situation is and would respond, honestly to those type of questions. But there's no way to compel people to tell us what their situation is. Another question, is there a common outcome in consideration? Well, there's actually a subcommittee that will be devoted to trying to find just those things. So we expect that there will be common outcomes that will cut across all of the interventions, but those are to be determined.
I mean, I think this is a work in progress, and we really don't know any of the details yet. I think if this gets approved as a planning committee meeting, then the point would be to bring a lot of people together to plan it. So we don't really know what's going on yet. We don't really know what the interventions will be. If we don't even know if it'll get approved, but just to sort of keep people in the loop that this is something that is being worked on and actively discussed. That being said.
All right. Well, let's go on to our next speaker then. So really pleased to have our next speaker, Dr. Elise Adams, present on health policy and system level approaches to addressing disparities in cancer. Dr. Adams is the inaugural Stanford Medicine Innovation Professor and Professor of Epidemiology and Population Health and Medicine. And she's also the Associate Director for Health Equity and Community Engagement at the Stanford Cancer Institute. Her research focuses on racial and socioeconomic disparities in chronic disease treatment outcomes. Her research is focusing on evaluating the impact of changes in drug coverage policy on access to essential medications, drivers of disparity in treatment adherence among insured populations, and strategies for maximizing the benefits of treatment outcomes while minimizing harms through informed decision-making. She is, full disclosure, participating on the clinical trials planning meeting process that we just covered, and today will give us an overview of her research in disparities. Elise, over to you.
Thanks so much, Scott. Next slide, please. So first, I just want to acknowledge that the land that I'm sitting on are the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people, and we want to thank them for their stewardship of the land. Next slide, please. Today, I'm going to talk about a few things. For many of you, these will be things you've seen before, but I'm really talk about some health equity frameworks, how we think about health equity, strategies for addressing disparities, particularly in cancer, and why it requires an understanding of the importance of comorbidity. Then I'll talk a bit about disparities and where they come from, and sort of circle back to what Ruth was just talking about in terms of social determinants. I'll then sort of give one example of some work that we did in the health policy arena around Medicare Part D, and then finish around sort of why I think a transdisciplinary community engaged approach is necessary for addressing health inequities, particularly in the cancer space going forward. Next slide, please. So, so Paula Braverman came up with this really great description of the difference between sort of what it means to say health equity, and it really means sort of fair and just opportunity. Really, it's really about removing barriers to health, whether that's in the social context, the political context, the economic context, or in the healthcare system. Next slide, please. And this is just one of many, many frameworks that I've seen related to health inequities. You can imagine these come from a number of different sources, but I think what's important to note about health inequities is this, is that the healthcare system, as important as it is just one element that contributes to health inequities or health equity. And in particular, there are a number of factors that are not only have a large influence, but that are interacting in ways that perpetuate disparities over the long term, particularly in chronic diseases like cancer. And those start with sort of the socio-political context in which we live and work, that dictates things like your socioeconomic position, your status, your occupation. Those factors also then feed into, for example, whether or not you have health insurance, how good that health insurance is. It also influences issues related to how you interact with the healthcare system, biological factors, as well as psychosocial factors. And then in turn, how you relate to the healthcare system and then your ultimate healthcare outcomes. And what I like about this particular depiction of health inequities is on the left-hand side, you have sort of what we call the structural determinants and social determinants of health inequities. On the right-hand side, you have what we call the intermediary determinants. And the health system is this intermediary determinant, right? Often people have the disparities that already exist before people even walk through the door of the healthcare system. So we really need to think of things holistically in order to address the underlying causes of the disparities and hopefully to address them going forward. Next slide, please. So here in California, this just provides a sort of a bit of a snapshot, forgive all the different numbers. But the point here is that we do have disparities in Northern California, even though in Northern California, in terms of cancer outcomes, we actually do a little bit better than many places in the country. But what's particularly alarming is that even though our disparities have, or our cancer outcomes are getting better over time, which is depicted on the top graph, sort of these declines in mortality, we also note that there are differences in risk related to who you are. So the orange line in this case represents non-Hispanic, Black, or African-American populations in Northern California, where we see this declining rate of mortality, but still mortality is higher for non-Hispanic Blacks and compared to non-Hispanic whites, for example. Similarly, the graphic displayed below show these racial and ethnic differences across the board for different types of cancers, where really, again, sort of just focusing on the orange line just gets a little bit easier. You can see how dramatically different risk is when you look sort of across and then down the rows. And so, for example, in breast cancer and colon cancer and prostate cancer, you can see that African-American and Black patients are at much higher risk for mortality and incident cancer related to others. Next slide, please. Now, it's really important to recognize, I think, that in the case of cancer, we can't talk about cancer without talking about comorbidity. The reason is the most common chronic disease that people have these days is multiple chronic conditions. So when we have a sort of disease siloed approach, we miss, I think, opportunities to really understand and better understand the context of health disparities, how they emerge, and how to address them. So, for example, when we look at comorbidity, it is actually one of the driving factors for non-cancer related mortality risk among people with cancer. We also know that non-adherence to non-cancer drugs may increase risk of mortality among people with cancer. And we also know that Black and African-American cancer patients are at higher risk for non-adherence. And on the right-hand slide, you see sort of these differences. There's a Kaplan-Meier curve related to all-cause survival. And much of this work has been done by Don Hirschman on this call and others on this call as well, relating to risk of cancer and comorbidity, and why it's so important to look at comorbidity when we're thinking about cancer disparities. Next slide, please. So this really shows some differences that we found when we looked among patients with adherence at Kaiser Permanente, or sorry, with insurance at Kaiser Permanente, Northern California. And we wanted to know for people with a new diagnosis of cancer, who also had competing conditions or concurrent conditions, what was going on in terms of adherence to these medications. And we were curious at the time to find out whether or not a new cancer diagnosis would actually disrupt adherence to pre-existing comorbidity. And what we actually found was that a new diagnosis of cancer was not particularly disruptive to adherence to other medications, for example, your statins or your anti-diabetes or antihypertensive medications. However, what stood out were the drastic disparities or differences between different subgroups in terms of adherence overall. So on the bottom, on the x-axis, what you have are sort of the different subgroups. And as you go along the lines, the dark line is adherence. So you can see adherence was actually much higher in this particular cohort among our Native American and Alaska Native community, which was small, but adherence was higher in that group for these other non-cancer medications, as well as for whites, it was somewhat higher. But then we looked at African Americans or Blacks, Latinx populations, Asian Pacific Islanders, and others of multiracial ethnic groups. We saw lower adherence to those medications even before the cancer diagnosis, as well as after the cancer diagnosis. So while the cancer diagnosis did not have a detrimental effect on adherence to these other medications, it did not increase adherence, nor did it have an impact on disparities in adherence for these medications. Next slide, please. So we, and a lot of our work takes sort of a health system and health policy approach to these factors. We realize in terms of those structural factors that influence access, that policies make a huge impact, right? So if there are policies in place that shift people towards a particular medication or away from getting particular types of services, that can have a dramatic impact on the ability of providers to actually provide care. So we actually looked at, in particular, at Medicare Part D and sort of just understand what the impact of Medicare Part D was on cancer care and non-cancer drug use among people with cancer. Next slide, please. So we were particularly interested in evaluating the impact on outpatient prescription drugs, most notably outpatient prescription drugs, because they are so costly and because they are sort of a line item that you can see in the budget, often the first thing to get cut when health systems are struggling to pay for health services. This is particularly true in like, for example, state Medicaid programs. And in particular, in the state Medicaid programs, often prescription drugs are the target for supply and demand side cost-cutting measures, because it's something that they can see and cut and they know has an impact on their budgets. One particularly notable strategy that some states use are Medicaid drug caps, which basically says you can only get reimbursed for a certain number of prescription drugs per month. What that does is, say it's 5 or 6 prescription drugs per month. Once you get to prescription drug number 6, you're out of luck. You have to pay out of pocket. And if you could imagine people with multiple chronic conditions, you can very easily get up to 5 or 6 drugs. In fact, a lot of people, for example, with hypertension might be on 4 drugs just for their antihypertensive medications alone. So when you add on cancer, you add on diabetes, you start to see things add up. So we're really interested to see when Medicare Part D was implemented, which was the first time that we saw prescription drug benefit under Medicare, what the impact of that would be. People living in those restricted drug cap states, to have Part D, which disallowed these drug caps and was a more generous policy. And what was interesting about Part D is that everyone who had dual coverage for Medicaid and Medicare, who were actually enrolled full-time dual enrollees, were automatically shifted from these Medicaid programs to Medicare Part D overnight. And it was done automatically. So what that meant is you were randomized to a Part D plan, and for those who are coming from less or more restricted drug cap states, you might see differences in what the impact was. So we specifically looked at states where the Medicaid program was very, very generous versus very, very restrictive before Part D, and then looked to see what the impact was among people who were cancer survivors who have these multiple chronic conditions post Part D. Next slide, please. So basically the first thing we did is to say, okay, overall, what happened? And we saw when we looked at both, this is for everybody, when we looked at cost-related non-adherence, as well as people who spent less basic needs to pay for their medications, we actually saw improvements post-Medicare Part D among all Medicare beneficiaries. So this gave us an indication that at the aggregate level, there's something going on here. And so we might see something when we looked at the dual enrollee population. Next slide, please. And so we used an interrupted time series design. I won't go into great detail unless people want me to, but basically 5% sample of dual enrollees. And what we looked at again were states with very restrictive versus non-restricted drug caps before the policy. And on the right-hand side, it just shows you sort of a depiction of what ITS is. It basically says, the interrupted time series says, if you have a stable baseline in terms of utilization before a policy change, you can use the policy change itself as almost an external factor, an external intervention, if you will, and then look afterwards to see what would have happened if the policy not happened, which is the dashed line. The solid lines represent what actually happened post Part D, right? So that's basically the strategy that we use. It's a very strong quasi-experimental design. Next slide, please. So what we found was that the use of non-cancer drugs in drug cap and non-drug cap states before Part D really show these stark differences where in drug cap states, we saw much dramatically lower utilization of antidepressants, antihypertensives, and lipid-lowering drugs among people with cancer. Next slide, please. And what we really saw, what was really sort of notable for us is when we looked across and looked at differences by race and ethnicity, we saw growing trends in terms of increasing disparities in the use of these medications, which is represented by the lines you see on the right-hand side. We saw a trend towards increasing disparities across the board that was basically cut short by the implementation of Part D. So for those in drug cap states specifically, when we looked at Blacks and whites, the implementation of Part D resulted in a reduction in disparities between Blacks and whites in the utilization of non-cancer drugs among those with cancer and non-cancer related comorbidities. This was dramatic and happened across all three conditions, but was particularly dramatic for antihypertensives and, antidepressants and or statins or lipid-lowering drugs. Next slide, please. So what did we conclude? One, we concluded the removal of drug caps may have had a modest overall effect on access to non-cancer therapies among patients with cancer. We also found that Blacks and African-American Medicare beneficiaries with cancer may have benefited more than whites from this transition, which is something we had not shown before. These findings were consistent with studies suggesting a reduction in disparities post-Part D. However, they were inconsistent with our prior studies in diabetes, where we did not show that this transition had an impact to reduce the disparities in antidepressant use, for example. Next slide, please. So going forward, what does this mean? Well, it means that improving access has the ability to have some impact on whether or not we see sort of these disparities, but it may not be the whole story. And we really need to understand, particularly for patients with multiple chronic conditions, what they're addressing. We also know that there's a rising out-of-pocket drug costs, particularly for novel cancer therapies, for example, as well as the implementation of precision oncology, which in some ways you might think might help with some of these disparities, but it may also exacerbate health inequities. And certainly there's been a lot written about this lately, particularly with whether it's medications or other factors, that we want to make sure that these advancements in therapy are actually available to all, not just those who can afford it. Next slide, please. But some of the things that we're doing to address some of these issues related to precision medicine and therapy and affordability is we are, for example, leveraging machine learning and causal inference methodology to emulate copay trials, where we actually could pretend as if we're doing a trial where we randomize people to receive a lower copay versus higher copay, and then we're looking at people with multiple chronic conditions, including cancer, to see what the impact of that is on disparities. And what's the advantage there is that we don't have to wait for a policy. We can actually emulate the policy and then see what happens. We're also looking at had a paper released at NBER's working papers, which is now under review elsewhere, to evaluate the impact of the financial assistance programs, particularly at Kaiser Permanente, on treatment outcomes. So what does it do to adherence and outcomes when patients have financial assistance if they have trouble paying, and what is the impact there across different subgroups, including race and ethnicity? We're also looking at precision oncology in the sense that we're looking at strategies for balancing harms and benefits of different cancer treatments related to neurotoxicity, for example, and racial differences that we've observed in neurotoxicity among cancer patients using machine learning and artificial intelligence. We're also looking to see what can we do to improve the fairness of these algorithms in addressing health inequities, because we realize that using big data analytics can sometimes introduce disparities rather than reduce them. Finally, we're also looking to see, we actually just did a simulation of what was the impact of moving dual eligibles from fee-for-service into managed care and what the impact was on utilization and treatment of chronic conditions. We're also planning and hoping to get an R01 funded that Dr. Slater is leading, related to systems in actually New York, where we're looking at dual eligibles again to see what the impact is on disparities of different types of risk adjustment algorithms for addressing healthcare needs. Next slide, please. Finally, we recognize that in order for all of this to make sense, we need context, and the communities provide our context. Communities help us to understand the drivers of health inequities from their own perspectives and work with us hand in hand in our research to first identify the research questions all the way through to dissemination. We think it's critical in order to really have an impact on health equity that communities be involved from beginning to end in the research that we do. Next slide, please. And this might be my last slide. But thank you so much. And there was a lot in a very short period of time, but I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We will open it up for a few questions. Let's see if we've got a few. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind putting them on the chat, that's the best way, and Dawn and I can read them for Dr. Adams.
I think while we're waiting, I have a quick question. First of all, thank you. That talk was fantastic and really, right on target in terms of so many of the things that we should be thinking about. As we think of this platform study, or really any study that we do in the cooperative group, how do you think we can better address multiple chronic conditions? It's certainly been a huge interest of mine, and in terms of trying to improve global outcomes and reduce disparities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for your question. So I would say one of the things that our patients and caregivers talk to us about is focusing on the right outcomes, right? So we have a strong tendency to focus on specific outcomes that are more related to care and healthcare quality than they are necessarily on what matters to patients and their families. And so finding ways of integrating these sort of more patient-centered outcomes in integrating those into interventions is critical, because if we're not aiming for the right outcome that's right for patients, we're not going to necessarily get to where we want to be. I think another thing that we've been thinking about quite a bit in addition to those metrics is how do we integrate caregivers and others and other stakeholders into any intervention that we do to try to address some of these social needs. So for example, I know that Kaiser Permanente, Mateo Benegas, who many of you probably already know, was doing some work at Kaiser Permanente where they were trying to do some social needs interventions. And they learned very quickly that if they don't have people who have housing expertise, for example, or legal expertise and these other factors at the table, helping them think about the intervention, you sort of have this sort of rate limiting step when you're trying to intervene with people. Because there's so many different things that influence their ability to access care and the things that influence their ability to sort of follow sort of recommended practice that have nothing to do with healthcare that lay outside of it. So I really think sort of holistically doing some stakeholder mapping at the start to really make sure the right people are at the table, to make sure that we can tailor these interventions in ways that really get at the social determinants of health, not just sort of what's going on in the healthcare system.
Sorry, I was talking to myself. What a great response. Thank you so much for that. There is a question. It would be great to replicate and validate some of your neuropathy studies. Actually, we have an ongoing prospective cohort study. This was from Dan. And, talking about how to use some of the data that we've collected in these trials. And especially when we're talking about groups that are maybe underrepresented, we do pretty well in SWOG, but if we can pull these larger cohorts together, we can really try to answer some meaningful questions. So
absolutely,
those resources do exist.
Absolutely. We've been talking with folks from SWOG from the very beginning, and we'll continue to do our doors very, very open. Love talking with people about this stuff. We've actually been sharing strategies for using the EMR to get at some of the data. So we're very, very happy to do that. And we're actually have, as part of our procedure, once we actually have an algorithm that we think is pretty good and seems to be working and we've been able to validate it, is that we'll make that algorithm available to others so that others can do the same. And that's really our goal here, is to develop something that other people can implement. And so a number of people are involved in this, KP Northern California, KP Washington, Health Partners, and Stanford. But we're definitely hoping to broaden that out. And we love to hear from people and get your advice too. And we're working very closely, I should also say, with the Kaiser Permanente Northern California healthcare system, Ray Liu, Tatiana Kulevska, and others, to make sure that we're also thinking holistically about what's going on and changes in the healthcare delivery space that might influence our ability to actually implement the model going forward.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And we really look forward to future collaborations. Actually, there's, I guess we should probably move on to the next talk, which is, but thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
From Dan Hertz, talking to us a bit about his drug-drug interaction screening tool for oncology and how that influences clinical trial enrollment. So take it away, Dan.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation to come back and give you a little bit of an update and ask for your help with this ongoing HOPE-funded SWOG pilot. We can go to the first slide, please. So just some very quick background. Most of the audience is probably familiar with drug-drug interactions. They can work through two main mechanisms, either a pharmacokinetic mechanism, which affects the amount of the drug in the body, or what we call a pharmacodynamic mechanism, which is the response of the drug to the body. We did some preliminary work in the Pharmaceutical Sciences Committee within SWOG. We know from looking across the different SWOG clinical trial protocols that drug interaction screening is an essential element of screening for all subjects to ensure that there aren't side effects or to ensure that the drugs that are being given for treatment have the expected efficacy. We found that about 50% of sites only screen drug interactions that are stated as exclusion criteria. So anything else that's in there about use with caution or should be further considered are essentially ignored. And the vast majority of the screening is actually occurring by the oncology research professionals. Those are research coordinators or nurses and not the pharmacists that are available at some institutions. So then we actually went to look at what the rates of drug interactions were on SWOG trials. We found two trials that collected comprehensive concomitant medication information representing 167 patients. And about 30% of patients have a major drug-drug interaction, and more than 10% of patients were enrolled onto the trial with a drug interaction that actually violated an explicit exclusion criteria and were allowed on the study anyway with those drug interactions. So whatever system we're currently using is clearly not working. Next slide, please. So this led to the development of our SWOG drug interaction screening initiative, where we wanted to try to figure out how to reduce drug interactions in patients enrolling on SWOG clinical trials so we can enhance efficacy, prevent toxicity, and ensure the accuracy of the clinical trial data from the studies that we all spend so much time developing. I'm going to walk you through the three objectives, the completion of the first two and where we are in the third one. So if we move to the next slide, please. So this is our drug interaction screening tool. It's essentially just a website that you can reach at pepid.com/SWOG. We can make this accessible to any or all SWOG ORP staff in the context of our clinical trial now and in the future to be used in standard care when they're screening a patient for enrollment onto a clinical trial. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of the specific functionalities that we built for SWOG drug interaction screening. If you can click to the next slide. So this is just a screenshot of what it looks like after the information has been put in. So in the upper left-hand corner, you insert the names of the drugs from the clinical trial the patient's being screened on. In the bottom left panel, you put the other medications that the patient is currently taking. In the upper right panel, it shows you the drug interactions that it found and the severity and the mechanism behind those. And in the bottom right, we included a panel so you could click on the individual enzyme or other drug interaction systems of interest, and those will show in the bottom center panel. So if your protocol says don't enroll anybody who's on a CYP3A4 or 5 substrate, and you click CYP3A4 in the bottom right, then that'll show up in the bottom panel based on what you put in the bottom left panel in terms of the patient's drugs. If you click another time, it'll show you all the different functionalities that we built in. I don't have the time to go through all these, but we did a lot of work talking with ORP about what they need this tool to do for them. And then all the way in the far upper right-hand corner, we have that create PDF button. If you click to the next slide, it'll show you what the PDF looks like. So all the information that you put in terms of the trial drugs, the medication list, the interactions that were found, the medication characteristics, all get dumped into a nice PDF export that you can print and put in the patient's study profile or file away wherever you need it. If we go to the next slide. So we did a pilot study just on usability where we had 13 different respondents, so 13 ORPs at 12 sites, and we had them use the tool for a month or two, and we asked them, were they confident using it? Could they use it easily? Was it complex, et cetera? So you can see the top 4 questions were sort of positive attributes. The next 5 questions were negative attributes. And for the positive attributes, you can see high degrees of agreement or strong agreement. And for the negative attributes, high degrees of strong disagreement or disagreement. So overall, we had very good usability characteristics. And we found that this actually significantly decreased the amount of time required to screen drug interactions for an individual patient. And we found that even though we're identifying a lot of drug interactions, we were excluding very few patients. So only 4% of patients had to be excluded due to a drug interaction that was identified using our tool. So if we move to the next slide. So now we're on sort of the third objective, which is a phase 2 implementation study, where we want to prospectively demonstrate the benefits to patient safety and the potential challenges to SWOG sites of implementing our drug interaction screening tool during SWOG trial eligibility assessment. Our aims are to show that our tool decreases the prevalence of undetected drug interactions, determine whether the tool improves the efficiency of screening, and then again, assess user satisfaction with our tool. If we go to the next slide, you can see the sort of study schema. This is a quasi-experimental study where we just start by identifying ORP staff at sites that are currently involved in drug interaction screening that want to help out on this study. There's then a pre-implementation period, so the tool is not in the hands yet of the staff, and they will give us information about patients who were screened for SWOG studies, either retrospectively based on the records that they have, or prospectively if they can't or don't want to do this retrospectively. Then we give the tool to the ORP staff, and then there will be a prospective phase where the ORP staff will actually use our tool and provide the same information about the patients that were screened and the outcomes. And then we would have another user satisfaction survey at the end. And again, this was supported by a Hope Foundation Seed Award pre-COVID times. If we go to the next slide. So in terms of the data collection, everything is collected via Qualtrics. There's no PHI being collected. We're essentially just asking which site this was at, the protocol number, and whether this is during the pre or post phase. And then for each patient, their medication list, whether or not a drug interaction was detected, the results of the screening, and how long it took to screen the patients. The ORP staff would submit each of those pieces of data through Qualtrics for each patient that were screened in the pre and post phase. And we are actually now paying ORP staff per patient that are screened up to $1,500 per staff member. And those checks are sent directly to the ORP staff, not to the site. So this is really a financial incentive to the ORP staff to do this additional work for us. If we go to the next slide. So this is just a little bit about the enrollment procedures. So we just need to find these ORP staff that are interested in participating in this. So that's why I'm hoping that you guys out there who work at these different sites, who might have staff members that might be interested in participating, all they have to do is contact us and enroll via Qualtrics. We do not need the site to activate this. We do not need a site PI. We do not need the IRBs at the sites to approve this. This is Michigan IRB approved. So all we need are ORP staff who want to participate. Again, during the pre-implementation phase, they can do this retrospectively or prospectively, and they'll be paid $10 per patient that they submit information for. Then we give them the information, the training and the login to our PEPID tool. Then they do the same thing for the prospective post-implementation phase, where they collect data for 4 to 6 months or a maximum of 50 patients, which is why their maximum would be $1,000 in the prospective phase. And then they complete their user satisfaction survey. Next slide, please. So just in summary, we have demonstrated there's a high prevalence of drug interactions in SWOG trial participants, and we think there's a critical need for a tool that can efficiently and effectively conduct uniform DDI screening. Our first generation tool within our feasibility pilot demonstrated high usability and usefulness. It decreased the amount of time required to screen drug interactions and led to low rates of trial exclusion. So we need at this point sites and ORP volunteers for our study. If any of you are at a site and might want to participate, please get in touch with me or have your ORP staff or whoever does your drug interaction and clinical trial enrollment eligibility screening get in touch with me, and we will get them all started again. This doesn't require sort of site activation or IRB. We're ready to go, and we already have sites participating currently. Next slide, please. I just want to thank the different sites that have participated at the different stages of this project, and I look forward to all your questions and suggestions. And again, please contact me if you might be interested in participating. Thank you very much.
So I guess while we wait for some questions to come in, I think that this is like really extremely important. We started looking at this at our institution. As you might imagine, I do think this is a huge disparities issue. We see, people that have higher comorbidities on more medications. The more medications you are on, the more likely you are to have drug-drug interactions. This is an issue for both clinical trial eligibility as well as for potential toxicity down the line. And it's super important.
Yeah, I guess I would just comment that, so there are definitely limitations in our drug interaction screening process in standard clinical care. I think the problem is even worse in clinical trial enrollment, where the people who would be involved in drug interaction screening, the pharmacists, aren't often involved in in screening for enrollment eligibility, and the drugs on the clinical trials that are being screened for are not in the drug interaction screening tools. So really, there's no way to effectively screen for drug interactions for investigational agents or on clinical trials. So we think this is a great tool that really solves a lot of problems, and we just need people to help out and participate in this study.
So there's a couple of questions wanting to know whether or not this tool is available for everybody in SWOG or just those that participate.
So we would make this tool to anybody who participates in this study. We can't make the tool available to everybody because we need to collect the data on its sort of usefulness before we just have everybody use the tool. We want to get the tool into the hands of as many people as quickly as possible, but we need to do this in the context of a clinical study where we can collect the data and demonstrate the usability and usefulness. And then once we do that, then we'll make this the sort of SWOG standard process and tool, and then everybody will have access to it. That would be the hope.
Great. And another important question is how this compares to like the EHR-based drug interaction systems like Epic's drug interaction.
Yeah, so I'm looking at these questions. The tool is currently a website. I don't know, I'm not exactly familiar with what CTMS is. I imagine that means like an electronic health record. The tool can interact with the electronic health record to automatically pull in the patient's concomitant medications. We don't have that functionality enabled at this time, but that is already sort of built into the system. The EHR-based drug interaction screening is not really well calibrated to the things that are important. So you'll get a lot of flags for minor sort of hypothetical interactions that can be ignored. Our tool has different interaction severities, and we have it set so that it only actually flags an interaction of grade 3 or higher, which would be sort of a moderate or major interaction, and excuse me, a major or severe contraindicated interaction. It'll ignore anything that it's grade 1 or 2. You can modify those settings as you want. Using this tool, testing standard drugs in precision medicine. I'm not too soon to think about using this tool. I'm not sure exactly what you mean. If you provide a little bit more information, I'd certainly be happy to answer. Any legal issues from missed drug-drug interactions? Yeah, I think that there are sort of legal issues with the fact that we are not screening for drug interactions. There are legal issues for the fact that drug interactions are occurring that get overridden in alerts that we aren't paying attention to. I think that any drug interaction software or tables or tools all will say this is just an information tool and it's used to provide information that should be used in the context of clinical knowledge. So really what we're hoping is that the individual who does the drug interaction screening, which is usually a study coordinator or study nurse or someone, will do this initial screening. If they find that something that's grade 3 or above, they will then forward that to the PI or a pharmacist or to SWOG or for someone else to further evaluate. We don't expect the study nurses or data managers to actually be making the decisions on these drug interactions, but we think that this tool is much better than the current process, which is just that we ignore this as an issue and hope that there aren't drug interactions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was really great. And but we should probably move on to the next set of talks at this time. So anybody that has any interest in participating, please reach out to Dan, and so that he can finish this study. So I think next up is I think this is the end of their slides, so I'm a little, maybe we want to, if you can move them to the beginning. I don't know if it's my issue, but, or if I'm having any IT problems, because it looks like everybody else is frozen.
No, I'm seeing the next steps. Are there some slides ahead of this that for Meghna and Jens to present?
Yeah, I think we need to go back a few slides.
Okay. Yeah.
There we go.
There we
That's the
go.
first one. Yep.
Yeah, right there. Okay. Meghna, over to you.
You want me to go ahead and get started? Okay, great. Well, thank you guys for inviting us back to give an update on S2108CD. I'll be presenting on the behalf of Dr. Reuter and I this study. So this is a cluster randomized trial comparing an educationally enhanced genomic tumor board, or EGTB, intervention to usual practice to increase evidence-based genome-informed therapy. We've presented this study quite a few times, most recently at the summer meeting. And the major update after that was that very shortly after the summer meeting, we presented the concept at the CCDR steering committee, and we did get approval of the concept. So we're currently in the protocol writing phase. So just as a reminder about the study, so this is going to be a cluster randomized trial of the intervention among 18 NCORP recruitment centers. And we're defining a recruitment center as an outpatient clinic or group of clinics that belong to the same NCORP or MU NCORP or subcomponent site who will be contributing both patients and physicians to the study. So once a recruitment center is selected, they will enroll both patients and physicians to the study. Those recruitment centers that are randomized to the intervention will have access to structured GTB as well as supporting educational materials for their physicians. All of the patients that are enrolled to a recruitment center on the intervention arm will be presented at the structured tumor board. In the control arm, the recruitment centers will continue with their usual practice. And the primary endpoint of the study is going to look at the proportion of patients that are started on evidence-based genome-informed therapy at 6 months. The eligibility criteria are on the slide. I won't go through everything in detail since we've talked about it before. Next slide, please. So these are the study objectives. And as we're writing the protocol, there have been some very minor changes to this, but this gets the general idea across. Again, we talked about what the primary objective is to look at the receipt of evidence-based genome-informed therapy at 6 months after registration. We'll also have secondary objectives looking at physician genomic confidence and physician experience with genomic tumor testing, to look at clinical outcomes in patients in both arms, so looking at overall survival as well as time to treatment discontinuation. And then we're also going to look at compare physician assignment of evidence-based genome-informed therapy to the primary objective, which is a blinded central review of that determination. We also are going to focus a part of the study looking at implementation of the genomic tumor board. We think it's really important to take a look at how we can implement this intervention at sites and understand the evolution of the utilization of genome-informed therapy, genomic tumor testing across all of the recruitment centers in order to see how we can apply this broadly across various different communities and populations. Next slide. So again, where we are with the next steps, this has been approved to the by the steering committee. We're in the protocol development stage, and the protocol writing is underway to be submitted very shortly. Before we submitted to the steering committee, we did talk to a lot of people that are on this call right now, trying to identify sites that want to participate in this study, and we were very happy to have many sites that are interested. We still have you on our screening list, and we will, once we have more information about the application process, or once we finalize information for the application process, we'll be reaching out to you. But if you weren't on that initial list and you are interested in learning more or participating in the study, please feel free to reach out to me or Jens, and we'd be happy to keep you in the loop. That's it.
Thanks, Meghna.
Great.
Yeah.
I know it's been a long time coming for you guys, but it's almost here. It's almost gonna be launched. So that's really, really exciting. And certainly anybody who's on today who was interested in participating should reach out to Jens or Meghna. This is going to be, I think, a very impactful study, and we're so pleased that it's got to this point.
there's a question from Jeff Berenberg about wanting to know about how you're going to handle uptake of non-evidence-based therapy.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think really important to assess in here. So that is going to be one of our, we are going to be collecting that data as well. How we're determining evidence-based genome-informed therapies is going to be a central review by Jens and I, a central blinded review of all of the patients enrolled in the study and what treatments they received in that 6-month post-registration period compared to what their genomic tumor results showed. So we will be able to identify which patients also received non-evidence-based therapy.
Any other questions from anybody? Well, our fingers crossed the protocol will be approved by the next in-person meeting in April. And so we look forward to that.
Thank you.
Excellent. So,
go ahead, Dawn.
I guess, okay, so for S1912CD, randomized trial addressing cancer-related financial hardship through the delivery of a proactive financial navigation intervention or credit. Vina, the study is activated, so please take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dawn and Scott. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to kind of give an update on the credit study. Many members of the study team are here on this call, and we're excited that the study is now active and enrolling. Let's go to the next slide. So I think this is kind of on theme with some of the earlier presentations. The goal of this study is to address financial needs of patients and caregivers in the hopes that this will help decrease household financial hardship and improve patient and caregiver outcomes. The schema shown here, we're essentially enrolling patient and spouse caregiver dyads to either an intervention or a control arm. In the intervention, as you can see, patients and caregivers will receive financial assistance and counseling and navigation with our partners, Sense and Patient Advocate Foundation. And then as well as financial literacy training through an online series of videos. And then the control arm will receive the financial literacy training alone. The intervention will be delivered over the course of 6 months, and patients and caregivers will be asked to complete surveys over the course of a year. Next slide. Just kind of some updates on the protocol. So we have we've received some emails from many of you on this call, and we're trying to compile it into a frequently asked question document just for convenience, and we'll be posting that to the CTSU site on October 22nd. And protocol revision number 1 has been submitted basically to address some confusion around what information is required from the spouse caregiver. Specifically, we will not be accessing medical records for the spouse, and that I think that was unclear in the prior version. Next slide. In terms of where we are, so the study activated on July 26th, and I'm very excited to report that we had our first accrual to the study yesterday. Perfect timing. And I wanted to use the time that we have just to ask anybody on the call to comment on how things are going, if you've approached any subjects, what barriers you've identified to enrolling, any questions about eligibility. So, feel free to just go ahead and ask questions.
So there's a question in the chat.
Yeah. Right.
If this is for first-line therapy only and the timing of that.
Yeah, so essentially it will be because we're enrolling people within 120 days of their diagnosis and within a window of time around first treatment. So yeah, essentially newly diagnosed patients.
So, Vina, one of the things, and maybe you have some experience with caregiver trials, we just put this through our institution, actually. So it's, you know, it takes a while, so that may be why you haven't seen so many accruals yet, is actually about the strategy for pre-screening patients and their caregiver. It's a unique thing for us. We haven't really had so many trials like that in terms of the criteria of what, given that they have to be filing for a joint tax to be eligible. And if you have any suggestions about how to identify those patients or bring it up with patients, what their marital status is.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think there's a question in the chat that or comment that one of the barriers is that we're requiring that the caregiver that's enrolled is married or filing jointly tax returns. And that's primarily because we are trying to study financial status at the household level, so they have to be linked financially. It's not to say that people who are not married or who have other kinds of caregivers are not facing financial distress. It's just mostly a scientific decision in some ways too. But you know, I think that a lot of people do show up with their caregivers in clinic, so I think that's an opportunity. Usually marital status is listed on the EMR, so that might be helpful as a screening. I mean, I think those are the primary strategies to, you know, and I think your question around, can you just ask people? I think, you know, I think asking is fine. But yeah, I mean, I think there will still be potentially some barriers around people who have significant others or other caregivers involved who may not be eligible, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we noticed is that marital status is actually quite inaccurate in EPIC, in our EPIC system anyway. So, you know, we're trying to develop new strategies to try to figure out, you know, how to get at those questions, especially if a patient doesn't come to the appointment with a caregiver or a spouse. It's not always so clear. So I think, you know, and Barbara, you know, also asked how many patients have been offered the trial. Sometimes that's, you know, I think, you know, this may be a good opportunity for us to learn from each other about recruitment strategies. So, you know, as we start to see sites, you know, that have figured it out or figured out what questions to ask, it would be good to share with the whole group so that we can learn from each other, you know, how to best get at some of these issues.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat around, you know, marital status, the word marriage, and the, you know, could we consider partners? These are all things that, this is actually kind of the feedback we're looking for. So we can definitely think about some of these things. Dr. Symington wrote that we're not allowing visitors at the visit because of COVID. So that could be an added barrier to trying to discern marital status or partner status. So that's, hopefully that'll improve as things go forward. But yeah, that is an issue.
I don't know if anybody has any other suggestions from having done, you know, sort of these kind of linked accruals. It's there's certainly a lot of interest in this area, but any suggestions people have or strategies, even after this call, you know, if you sort of hit that sweet spot and figured out the right thing to do, please let us all know so that so we can pass on that information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dina, have you done other studies that involve like a linked patient caregiver?
We have at our institution. The difference was that we were not absolutely requiring the caregiver to participate. So this is different because the patient can only enroll if they have a willing caregiver also enrolling. So I think, yeah, that is just an additional barrier potentially, or there are more questions that are involved to screen people. I would absolutely agree that if you have any comments you want to share, just email either the credit email address listed here or me personally. Always willing to hear thoughts. And the other thing I'll mention is that, to Don's point, for 1417, we were very slow to accrue for like, I think 6 months or something like that before we got our first patient on. And then actually it was some of the patient advocate work, and also sites sharing their recruitment strategies and just kind of how they're talking about financial issues that actually really helped. So I totally would say that if anyone has if any of the sites have any feedback on what was successful, definitely let us know.
Great. All right, so maybe we should move on.
Thanks, everyone.
Next slide. Okay, so Melissa's not, Dr. Agardino's not on the call. So just as a brief update, this is 1703, the schema. This is not a CD study, but something we've been developing for some time. That is a randomized non-inferiority trial comparing patients monitored with serum tumor marker-directed disease monitoring versus usual care if they have metastatic hormone receptor positive HER2-negative breast cancer. And a whole, this study has also been slow to accrue. A slew of modifications were made to make it much easier in terms of some of the requirements and the time frames. It was also hit a bit because I think during COVID, people just adapted this policy because it was easier for patients to get screened less. But since then, since these modifications have gone through, enrollment has picked up. There are currently 278 enrolled to step 1. I think with an increasing rate of enrollment, especially over this past year, which is fantastic. It is a very easy study to enroll patients on once you find them eligible. So I would strongly encourage sites to consider opening it. I think another thing that's really helped was that we got champions. This is relatively recently at some of the other groups. We identified champions both in ECOG, Akron, and in Alliance. So we're hoping that that also helps with accrual. This is an important screening question, surveillance question, but it dramatically influences the way we deliver care to our patients. So for anybody that's enrolled, keep enrolling. I mean, I had 2 patients last week that met eligibility. For those that haven't, please consider opening it. Next slide. Okay, so this, again, as I said, I think I mentioned all of these points. There are also now regular webinars, I didn't mention that, with CRAs and PIs to think about the ways to, strategies people have used to increase accrual. For this study, there is remote consent, so it should be relatively easy. And there is a plan in the next several months to look at the data and probably modify the non-inferiority margin, which I think will reduce the overall sample. Well, it will definitely reduce the overall sample size. So those are other things that are in the works. So any questions or feedback, please contact Dr. Agardino at the email listed on this slide. I don't know if anybody has any particular questions about this. I think we can probably move to the next slide. Matt, are you on?
Yeah, I'm ready to go. Hi. Good afternoon, colleagues. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're faring well under the circumstances, and I'm sorry that we're not able to see each other in person. I think you're all familiar with the clinical work intensity study that we're trying to advance, so I'll just provide you a brief update. I also want to particularly thank Dr. Vaja for her sage counsel and Ms. O'Kane for helping us advance this work to this point. Next slide, please. So I just want to give a brief study update to bring everyone up to speed with where we're at. First, on July 26th, we presented the concept to triage, and then on the 30th, we received an approval letter, hence our new number S2203 CD. The committee was anxious to know if we had secured any commitments to participate in the study, and I informed them that we had no commitments yet, but the concept was well received by community affiliates, and I encourage you all to reach out to me if you have any interest in participating in the study. Of course, this is all pending approval and if the study moves forward. The committee also expressed some concerns about a potential selection bias where sites that either had higher or lower workloads might be differentially positioned to participate. Now, I think that the landscape studies might be useful here. Those data might help us either prospectively or retrospectively consider whether there are any potential differences between participating and non-participating sites relative to select organizational factors. And that might give us a sense of whether there are any differences between participating and non-participating sites. The triage committee also wanted to be sure that we were collecting organization-centric data, and I've obviously assured them that this is the case. And as you know, our study may help community sites become more practiced in collecting those data, because I'm convinced that as CCDR evolves, the studies are going to increasingly require organization and system level data to better understand both the care context and the processes that are influencing care delivery. So here, maybe you can even look at this study as an opportunity to make some trans-departmental collaborations that might be necessary for collecting system level data, not just in this study, but other studies moving forward. Next slide, please. So as I've alluded to, we have some next steps here that remain. We are going to present this concept to our CCDR steering committee on November 10th. Rest assured, I'm crossing my fingers. I'm not ashamed to say that I want this thing to move forward. I'm very optimistic about the work, and I'm hoping others feel likewise. If you have any questions or if you want to express your interest in participating, I've left you my email address. Obviously, I'll welcome any questions or comments anyone has now, but I'll surrender the floor to the chairs to expedite the program.
Thanks, Matt. I think both Don and I have our fingers crossed too. This is a hugely important study. Just about anyone who practices right now in oncology understands that this is an important issue. We're really hoping the steering committee does as well, and that you get a chance to move this forward. So thanks for the presentation, and we'll see you on November 10th. Next slide,
yeah,
please.
And just Matt, just as a plug, it's all about resilience, right? So, the presentation.
Doctor, do you think I've gotten to this point because I'm smart? No, it is definitely not the case. So I'm well aware.
Yeah. Vina and Jens had an initial rejection and came back in and ultimately got the committee's approval. So we just take it one step at a time.
Yeah, and we've got your back, and we really, again, want this one to succeed. So it will. All right, next one.
Well, colleagues, I'm indebted to you for your collegiality, and thank you very much for your support and friendship. Thanks,
Matt. I believe I saw Karen Ferris on the call. There she is. Yes. Are you ready to present S2201 CD? Excellent. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so we're going to continue with the theme of persistence and resilience here when I give you my update. So you guys have heard about this quite a few times. So next slide, please. Here are the aims of our trial. We're trying to quantify the effectiveness of the OAA Rapid Pro model on treatment failure at 12 months for patients receiving oral anti-cancer agents. Our aim 2 is to describe the facilitators and barriers of adoption, blah, blah, blah. You can see that. And then number 3, importantly, to characterize the extent to which patient factors that contribute to health inequities predict or modify the effect of the intervention. So those are our aims. And then the schema is on the next slide. And this is aim 1, where you can see that we want to randomize and stratify 24 sites. We would have 12 intervention practices, 12 usual care practices, 495 patients across those 12 practices. The intervention practices will undergo an intervention training program that lasts about 12 weeks, and then they will be asked to proactively interact with their patients who are receiving a new oral anti-cancer agent and to receive information related to symptomatology and adherence from those patients. And then we will measure the effectiveness of that. Next slide. Then this shows you aim 2, where we will focus just in the intervention sites to understand the facilitators and barriers. Next. And then aim 3, we will take the results from aim 1 and then focus on demographic, socioeconomic, and geographic characteristics and determine how those impact the outcomes. Next slide. So updates, persistence. So you can see that we were reviewed and we were not discussed. And I was very, very sad, as you might imagine. However, I want to thank Dawn and Joe for their incredible support on putting together the RO1 that we submitted. Just super responsive, so helpful, as well as Pat Mize, Patricia O'Kane, and Tess Hurley. So this wouldn't have gone in without all of their support. And so I just want to thank them for that. We're going to get comments back, as you know, in about 21, 25 days. We'll take a look at those and we are going to address those and resubmit because it's what we do. And I don't think I have any more. I have one more slide about contacts. Yeah. I do wonder if, reviewers were like, you didn't have letters from all the sites who are going to participate. So I have a feeling we're going to hear that. So we may be coming back to you for more explicit commitment if that's something that we hear from reviewers. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as we said from before, we've all had many unscored grants. I think that percentage is going up, but it doesn't mean anything for the future. So we'll just take those comments and figure out how to make the study better because it's a really super important issue.
Karen, and I'd also encourage you to take a look at other funding announcements, particularly from ACS and from PCORI. Both of those groups would, this work would, I think, fit for both of those groups. And so there may be some announcements where you can respond, as opposed to diving back in the RO1 pool, which is just, kind of an open. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you, Scott. Time. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I also wanted to thank Kathleen and Ann, who gave us feedback on our AIMS pages a couple times at NCORE, and that was really, really helpful. So just thank everyone. Folks, this group is amazing.
And I think the other thing that it might be worth looking at, there was recently something in the New England Journal about optimal drug dosing and toxicities. And, I think these issues of oral drugs are sort of, hitting maybe people that haven't been so aware of issues with oral drugs, but the FDA had something just in the past week or two. So there was a commentary on oral medications in particular. So it might be worthwhile looking at that. Yeah, great. So next slide. Okay.
Randall, are you on?
Dr. Holcomb?
There he is. Okay, let's turn it over to you for your presentation. Thanks, Randall.
Well, thanks very much, Scott and Dawn. I'm going to give a quick update on a patient-centered video education intervention to improve rural cancer care delivery on behalf of me and my co-investigator, Azumi Akato. Next slide. This is funded through a seed grant through the Hope Foundation. Next slide. This is just a little bit of background. I think all of you know this, that rural residents have higher mortality rates from cancer than urban residents, and there are lots of socioeconomic disadvantages as well. And there are unique challenges for care coordination, including limited access to specialty oncology services, long travel distances, also challenges in seeking and finding information. These are especially severe in Hawaii. Two of the gaps we have are a lack of patient-centered care coordination interventions designed specifically for rural cancer patients, and also understanding the impact of care coordination on cancer care delivery outcomes. Next slide. So our hypothesis for this study was that rural cancer patients experience poor care coordination that contributes to adverse care delivery and adverse patient outcomes, and an educational intervention for rural cancer patients would improve their care coordination experiences. And this study is being done on Kauai, Hawaii, and also the island of Maui, which doesn't have an arrow on this slide, but does on our latest version. Next slide. So aim one was to assess early stage rural cancer patients' perceptions of care coordination and see if they correlate with delays in active treatment, and also perform a survey with a measure of self-advocacy. But we're focusing on early stage rural cancer patients because, of course, these are the patients where we really want to cure them if possible, and want to avoid disruptions in their care. We will be surveying 60 adult patients with early stage cancer who are receiving adjuvant chemotherapy on the 3 islands that I mentioned. Next slide. We'll be using a care coordination instrument, which we developed, a self-advocacy measure, and also be recording delays in active treatment. Next slide. Aim 2 is to develop and pilot test an educational intervention. This is going to be a TED Talk modeled patient video education intervention for rural patients, again, with early stage cancer. We're targeting patients receiving adjuvant chemotherapy, and we'll be assessing feasibility, satisfaction, as well as care coordination, self-advocacy, and cancer knowledge scores. Next slide. This is some images of our TED Talk style video education intervention. You can see I'm wearing my Aloha shirt here. We'll have 3 modules, one going over cancer basics, one focusing on care coordination, and one on self-advocacy. We're preloading these onto an Amazon Fire tablet, which will be provided to the patients. This will actually be an incentive that the patients will get because they'll be able to keep this tablet afterwards. And we're doing this because many of the areas where we're targeting do not have broadband access, and patients don't have good internet to be able to log on to these videos otherwise. Next slide. I've already mentioned a little bit about our outcome measures. We'll be doing a pre-post analysis and assessments for this aim 2, looking at these various different qualitative and quantitative outcomes. Next slide. So the current status, we've already gotten IRB aim 1 IRB approved. 8 patients have been enrolled. We've had some challenges related to COVID, having multiple meetings with various different practices on the on our rural areas on the different islands, and we've added Maui to our site plan to facilitate enrollment. For aim 2, we've already made the TED Talk style videos. We've figured out how to load them onto the Amazon Fire tablet, as long as we add a little extra memory, because we use up all the memory on the base model of the Amazon Fire otherwise. And the study approvals for the IRB are in process for aim 2 as we speak. Next slide. And this is our contact information. Azumi Okado is our site PI in Hawaii, and her contact information is listed there, as well as all of our co-investigators at the University of Hawaii and our collaborating partners. Thank you.
Well, great, thank you, and congratulations on your recent move. In terms of next steps for a SWOG study, what are you thinking in terms of bringing this to the rural populations, the vast number of rural populations in SWOG?
Yes, so we may, Dr. Okado and I have actually discussed expanding this with some alternative funding to Vermont so that we can look at some rural populations here as well as in Hawaii. We'd like to get the 20 patients enrolled on AIM2 and really look at our pre and post assessments to see if this has good patient satisfaction and improves knowledge about care coordination. We won't have the numbers obviously to see if it really impacts very much on care delivery, specific care delivery outcomes like delays in active treatment. But that's something that we're looking at now so that we can potentially utilize that in a larger, broader NCORP type study.
Let's see, I was looking at questions. There's a comment about getting data from Hawaii and Vermont. This is such a great use of Hope Foundation funds, and hopefully you'll get a signal that'll help you get to the next step in terms of applying for funding and broadening it to other SWOG sites.
Absolutely, we're very appreciative of the Hope Foundation for providing this funding so that we could move forward. I think that the opportunity to look at both Hawaii and Vermont, given Dr. Okado and my permanent locations at the moment, is really interesting. I think that the rural areas are not exactly alike, but I think that we will find that an intervention will improve care delivery in rural areas in both locations. So we'll see if that's indeed the case. But that'll be something that we'll really be looking for.
Excellent. Thank you. We should probably move on to our next presentation.
Yes, so I think Christine Dr. Veenstra could not be on today. We have heard her presentation in the past about development of a multi-level intervention to promote guideline concordant colorectal cancer surveillance. Next slide. The specific aims of this are to determine the effectiveness of this intervention in promoting partner engagement in surveillance and clinician awareness and facilitation of partner engagement in patients' care, to test the effectiveness in terms of guideline concordant surveillance amongst patients that have curative intent stage 3 colorectal cancer, and then identifying factors that affect implementation in community-based practices. Next slide. So I'm probably not going to go through all of the details of this, but this is their current together and after cancer intervention scheme, and really to try to identify patient factors, partner factors, and clinician factors. Dr. Veenstra had a Hope Foundation grant as well to get preliminary work to design a future study that can be done in SWOG. Next slide. I don't know how many slides there are. It should have just been a couple, but again, this is an online patient partner level intervention with modules. Next slide. I'm just going to skip to the end. Yeah, just go to the end. So next steps, yeah. So the plan for this, the study that she presented on at the last group meeting was to complete her pilot testing of this dyad component, which she's in the process of doing and further refining based on patient feedback. And she's developing a clinician-focused, a clinician-facing component. And we had heard that there may be an R34 RFA in the future, which we think that this may be an ideal study for, which is a mechanism that sort of allows for the development and integration of the intervention, and then ultimately, moving on to doing a multi-site randomized trial versus an RO1. So we're waiting for that RFA, but our hopes is that when that comes out, that this may be a good study or good fit for that. Next slide. Anyway, this is Dr. Veenstra's contact information. Next slide. Next slide.
That was the last slide.
Yeah. Oh, the last slide of the whole thing?
Correct.
Oh. Okay. Okay. So we just had a couple of other things actually on the agenda. I guess to mention, and that is our closed studies. So first, the closed study was 1417 CD, as you're all aware. Dr. Shankran had presented this in, I think, ASCO Quality or ASCO. Anyway, this past year. And the study has been, the manuscript has been accepted for publication at JNCI, and they're working on multiple different secondary manuscripts from all the super interesting data that was collected as part of SWOG 1417. So stay, I guess, tuned to subsequent studies that come from that. And Scott, I don't know if you want to give an update on S1415 CD.
Sure. We're in the process of writing up manuscripts for those. We do have some very interesting findings, some unexpected, some that might be quite influential. But we've had to kind of adhere to some non-release of the information pending submitting to manuscripts. So we're hoping to get at least 2 of the primary finding manuscripts out the door this year. And I think we will be successful with that. And then hopefully we'll be able to share the results with you, the main results at the spring meeting.
That's our goal, is to try to present to at least this group by the next meeting some of these the findings from that study. With that being said, I think that is the end of our agenda. I think, and Scott can go next, but I think, we just want to encourage everybody that if you have ideas for studies or for any of the HOPE mechanisms for studies, please let us know. We're happy to help and provide letters. To date, the HOPE Foundation has, as you have heard from these presentations to date, the HOPE Foundation has been extremely supportive of our investigators with interest in cancer control, cancer prevention, and cancer care delivery research. A lot of the presentations today did come out of HOPE Foundation funds. And so if you do have ideas, we're more than happy to help, or ideas of other studies that you want to pursue within our committee. And keep your eyes open for new activated trials. Scott, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just a couple of shout outs. One to Dr. Elise Adams and Dr. Ruth Carlos for joining us today and presenting their really interesting work. And then a quick shout out to the CCDR patient advocates who a lot of the stuff that we've presented, the patient advocates have been very involved with in terms of giving their feedback and helping making those studies better. And we're always grateful for that time.
Great. And I guess we will plan on a virtual call with the group, a working group, sometime between now and the next group meeting.
Looks like we get to leave people with a little extra time. So
Yep.
we'll let everyone go, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, colleagues.
Bye-bye.